Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and every couple of months I get these random packages in the mail from a company called Retroflag. They make these really cool cases for the Raspberry Pi, like this little mini Sega Genesis we looked at a few months ago. And basically it allows you to make your own retro console, just like the ones you might find from the major manufacturers. And today they sent me this, which I think is probably their best work to date. This is called the Retroflag G-Pi case. And what it lets you do is take a Raspberry Pi Zero and connect it up with this really cool looking Gameboy case that feels almost exactly like the original. And it allows you to play all of your retro games on a very retro-like device that, again, feels just like the original Game Boy felt, with a couple of extra buttons. So we're going to be taking a closer look at this new device here in just a second, but I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that this came in randomly, free of charge from Retroflag. However, all the opinions you're about to hear are my own. Nobody is paying for this review, nor has anyone reviewed or approved what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and take a look at what this cool little device can do. So let's take a closer look now at the hardware. I have no idea what this is going to cost because it is not yet available for sale, but I will update the video description with that information when it is available. And what we'll probably do is a follow-up live stream when it does come out, because they sent me a Raspberry Pi Zero that was configured already. There are a few things that you need to install to get it to work with the case. So I'll do that so you can see exactly how to get it all working from scratch. So in this instance, we're going to focus on the case and how you install the Raspberry Pi inside. And again, in the future, we will do a live stream on the software setup component. It's not going to be difficult, but I think there will be some things that you have to type in from the command line to get it all working. Now, it feels a lot like the original Game Boy, and one thing this company has been putting out is really high quality stuff. I refer back here again to that Sega Genesis thing. It feels so good. And this one really does remind me a lot of the original Game Boy I got in 1989 when I was 13. It's got a good feel to it overall. The display, though, is color. It's 320 by 240. And for the kind of retro games that you'll run on a Raspberry Pi Zero, this is the perfect resolution for it. So I think the games will look pretty nice on here when we do get everything booted up. Now, you do have to buy your own Raspberry Pi Zero to make this work. The good news is the Raspberry Pi Zero starts at $5, so it's a lot less expensive probably than the case will be itself. And they're now pretty readily available. There's also one called the Raspberry Pi Zero W that has Wi-Fi built in. That's a little bit more. I think that one's about $10, and I would go with that to make it easier to get your ROMs in and out of the device here, because part of what you install software-wise on here disables the HDMI output, and you have to go through and manually re-enable it to be able to hook up an external display through the HDMI port that's included on it. So if you get the Wi-Fi going, you can just drop in your ROMs over the network. Now, this is pretty cool because there is a virtual cartridge in here, and when you pop this out, this is actually where you put the Raspberry Pi Zero. It mounts inside of this case. And if you look inside of here, they even map the pinouts here almost identically to how the original cartridges used to work, and that interfaces with the display and the controller in there. So they took a lot of steps here to go for authenticity in its overall look, including designing this really crazy pin mapping here between the GPIO pins that will be on your Raspberry Pi Zero and all the functional components inside of the device here. It looks like they spent a lot of time figuring this out, and I think this is just a cool way to implement it. Now, like the original Game Boy, it can run on AA batteries. The only difference is that this one only needs 3 AA batteries, whereas the original used 4. I'm going to use some rechargeable nickel metal hydride batteries. Battery life is going to vary based on the kind of battery that you use in here. If you don't want to use the battery, you can hook up an external USB power supply, just like we used to do back in the day with the original Game Boy. They have a USB to cylinder connector here. You can just plug that USB cable into here, and the other end into your external battery pack, and of course you'll get a lot more life out of that. You got 2 extra buttons here on the front. They added some shoulder buttons here on the side, which is pretty cool. So for games that require some shoulder buttons, you've got that. So you've got a total of 6 buttons, which is nice. You've got a contrast wheel here. I'm guessing that adjusts the brightness of the display when it's turned on, which we'll look at in a second. And then over here you have a volume control, because there's a headphone jack here at the bottom, just like you remembered it from the original Game Boy, so that's pretty neat. The power switch is up here to fire everything up. It will take a little bit longer to boot up because it has to boot up the Raspberry Pi's Linux operating system, but once it's up, you can use RetroPie, which we'll be doing today, to navigate through all of the games to get those working. And one of the scripts that you install on here will allow the Pi to shut down safely when you flick the switch, which we'll show you in the course of the video. So it won't just cut power to it, it'll actually shut down properly and then turn off. And we demoed that with these other cases a few months ago, and I'll put a link to that video down below in the video description. Now, one last thing to look at on the hardware side is a USB connector here, so you can hook up a USB OTG cable and connect up memory sticks and that sort of thing if you want to transfer files over manually. So you do have the option to connect some external USB, but you will have to take the Raspberry Pi out to get access to the HDMI port and, of course, reconfigure the software. The only issue I'm seeing on the display is I've got some dust under it here, and it just could be that I've got a pre-release prototype here, so hopefully the real ones will not have any dust under the display, but that was one thing that I noticed on mine. Okay, enough blabbering. Let's get that Raspberry Pi installed and see how it works. All right, so let's flip it over and take out that Raspberry Pi mounting section, the virtual cartridge. We're going to pry that open. We've got a PCB in here that they want us to remove, and the first thing we're going to do is install a little ribbon cable in the Raspberry Pi, and they want you to install this little USB connector on the connector closest to the Raspberry Pi's processor. And we're going to fold it down like so. The next thing we're going to do is mount this in the Raspberry Pi case, and I believe we're going to be putting it into this portion first. And you'll see there are some screws in here, if my camera refocuses. There we go. So we're just going to line it up with the screw holes, and we're going to leave that part hanging down there. Now they've got some screws that I have to put in, so let me do that real quick. We'll get those screws secured, and we'll go on to the next step. All right, so we've got the Raspberry Pi now secured in the cartridge holder. You can see we've got these screws on top. These screws have another screw hole on them because we're going to be securing the PC board that came with this kit to the top of the Raspberry Pi. These pins will align with the GPIO sockets here on the Pi Zero, and that is how all of this stuff is going to work. Now, what I did right before I started recording again is I installed this ribbon cable inside of this little connector here, and the instructions will guide you as to how to get that installed properly. It's really hard for me to get it to work on camera here, so there's a little tiny door that you close after you get that ribbon cable inserted there, which I have done. And you want to be really careful because it will pop out very easily. So just keep an eye on that as you put the rest of the thing together here. But it is probably the most delicate portion of the construction process, is getting that cable secured in that slot. So the next thing we're going to do now is just screw the whole thing back together to keep everything in place and pins aligned. And once we're done with that, we'll come back and see if this thing will boot up. All right, we've got everything now secured inside of the virtual cartridge here. So as you can see, it is all screwed together and everything is aligning properly. And now we're going to just pop that virtual cartridge into the back of our Game Boy device here and flick it on. And this, again, will take a minute or two to boot up because we do have to boot the Raspberry Pi up to its operating system and then, of course, launch the front end. And again, this one came pre-configured, so we'll do one of these from scratch when all the patches are available for download. They weren't available at the time that I was recording the video here. So let's let this boot up here, and when it's ready to go, I will show you what games are like on this Raspberry Pi case. All right, so we've got everything booted up now, and it takes a little bit of time for it to come up, but then you've got RetroPie, and if you've ever installed RetroPie on your Raspberry Pi, this is the same experience. And what better way to start off with some RetroPie on a Game Boy case than the Game Boy itself? And we'll take a look at Batman here and see how this runs. Just takes a second for it to load up the emulator and the game itself, and then what you'll see here is it basically defaulting to that green hue we all know and love from the original Game Boy days. The display on this is very nice. It's got great viewing angles. It's definitely IPS. I think it's the right resolution. You don't need super high res for retro games by any stretch, and it looks really good here, actually. Let me pull up the audio for you real quick. I'm not going to go too loud so you can still hear me talk, but I did notice that there is a good amount of noise that you will hear over headphones. So whatever it's using to channel audio out to that headphone jack is not very well shielded, and that will become evident especially when you have headphones on. When music is playing and the game is rocking, you're not going to hear it all that much, but certainly in quiet moments you will. I was definitely hearing it in the menu area too, so that is one area I think just to be aware of, that you will get a good amount of noise on there. But it feels pretty good. The games look great on here. It's kind of fun playing them in a form factor that I remembered playing them in, so that was great. And overall, I think it's not bad considering what it's running here. The emulation quality will be as good as the status of development on the Raspberry Pi. So as things develop on the Pi and on RetroPie and RetroArch and all the other emulators that are out there, you will see improvements over time. And overall, I think it's not a bad little pairing here of a nice retro case with a Game Boy emulator. Let's take a look, though, at a few other things. So I thought I would check out a PlayStation 1 game next. This is Ridge Racer. It seems to be running okay, although I'm seeing some slowdown and some graphical glitches here and there. And again, that's due to the emulation running on the Pi and the fact that we're using the $5 Raspberry Pi Zero to run it all. So PlayStation's probably pushing it, although I'm sure there are some games that might work well on there. The speaker down here sounds okay. It's not spectacular, but I think it actually is pretty close to what the original Game Boy had. I am hearing that noise through the speaker also, especially when the volume is up on it. Let me back out of here real quick and take a look at some other stuff. The display brightness control here works pretty decently. You can step it down, as you can see here, and save your batteries a little bit, and you can also go bright on it as well, so not bad there. Now the Pi Zero emulates the Sega Genesis quite well, and it runs very nicely here on the case, of course. As you can see, we've got Sonic the Hedgehog running, which is always a very fast game. The display looks great. We're not seeing a lot of motion blur, if any, even when Sonic really gets going here, and overall it's got a really good feel to it. Now I did test the button latency on this because that is one of the things that you often run into when dealing with a Raspberry Pi and emulation. And what I did is I shot the screen with my iPhone at 240 frames per second, and then I jumped around in a few of the menus to see how quickly things reacted. I was using some of the text-based configuration screens to get a good immediate response to a button press. And I'm getting about 80 to 100 milliseconds of latency on the controller with this, and that's due to the fact that we've got a low-powered Raspberry Pi, we've got the display going here, we've got some USB to deal with, so it's about where you would expect a Pi to be with latency, which means it won't be as good as an original console and certainly not as good as the more expensive FPGA-based devices we've looked at recently from Analog, but it's not any worse than what you would get with other Raspberry Pis. So you will feel it a little bit, I think, especially for a game like Sonic that is very much dependent on very accurate button pushes, but it's not something that was as bad as some Android emulators I've seen in the recent past here. So not too bad on the button latency front, again about 80 to 100 milliseconds as you're running around on there. Now another good pairing for this form factor is the Game Boy Advance, which used 2 buttons as well, plus the 2 shoulders here on the back. I'm running Metroid here. It seems to be going okay. There are some games that feel a little bit sluggish on the GBA on the Pi Zero. I'm going to point you to ETA Prime's channel because he's done a lot of work on these emulators, and I think you might be able to get some tips on tweaking the Pi Zero to work best with some of these Game Boy Advance games. But I think your best success will be Game Boy, Game Boy Color, the NES, the Sega Master System, maybe the Genesis as well, but don't expect a lot out of this little processor. This is not the same experience as what you would get out of the Raspberry Pi 3, which has much greater performance than the Zero does here. But overall, I think this is a really cool case that is very well constructed from a hardware standpoint. My only disappointment with it is the fact that the audio isn't very well shielded, so you will hear some noise on headphones, and if you're sensitive to that, it's going to bug you. But the feel of it is excellent. It really has an original plastic feel to the original. The controller feels very authentic. Everything about this really reminds me of all the many hours I spent playing my Game Boy back in the day. And if you configure it correctly, when you throw the switch here, what will happen is it will execute a script that will shut down the Pi properly. So as you can see here, it is now quitting the emulator and running through all the standard shutdown procedures so that when I do throw the switch on it and wish to turn it off, it actually shuts down without just randomly cutting power to the device. And that is definitely the preferred way to go. So there will be some steps involved in getting this to work, not only from the hardware standpoint, but also from the software standpoint. We'll come back again with a live stream detailing how to get the software configured once all of the patches are available. But I just like what they did here. This is a really cool concept, and it's actually functional, provided you are setting your expectations properly for what the Raspberry Pi Zero can do. And I would imagine over time, if they release newer Raspberry Pi Zeros that fit in the same form factor that might be more powerful, this will continue to get better there over time. So altogether, a really fun little quick project you can do. Buy a $5 Raspberry Pi Zero, and you're pretty much in business here. With a fun little kit that you can put together yourself and have a very nostalgic run at some old games and some newer ones too, with a nice display on a very familiar case design. So we'll be back soon with more on this, and once it is available, I'll put a link as to where you can buy it. And until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.